welcome. We're happy to have you here today at Lead and Water Testing Requirements and Mitigation Support for Illinois Schools and Child Cares. The goal of today's webinar is to provide you with a comprehensive overview of the lead and water testing requirements for schools and child care facilities per state and federal rules. In addition, LeadCare Illinois will introduce their program, which supports lead and water testing and provides mitigation support for Illinois schools and child cares. So we're excited to have with us today representatives from LeadCare Illinois and the Illinois Department of Public Health to help navigate schools and child care lead and water testing requirements. Caroline Pakenham is the Director of Water Programs at Elevate, the organization charged with administering LeadCare Illinois, and Liz Ornelas is the Project Manager for LeadCare Illinois. They are joined by Brian Cox, the Public Health Plumbing and Water Quality Program Manager at the Illinois Department of Public Health, providing oversight and funding for the program. And for the question and answer session, they will be joined by Adam Nutt, the Lead and Copper Coordinator within the Compliance Assurance section of the Illinois EPA. So welcome to everyone. We're excited to have you here today. I'm Ruth Kersey, Project Manager at Elevate. I manage the Cook County TAP program, and I'll be your facilitator today. Here's a quick overview of the agenda. We'll start things off with an introduction to Cook County TAP, sort of what we've been up to, and then we'll move on to the topic of the day. So feel free to ask your questions at any time in the question box, and we'll get to those during the Q&A session and be joined by Adam Nutt. So here's a quick update on Cook County TAP. I know many of you have been here before, so I'll try to make this brief. Cook County TAP is a resource hub designed to accelerate healthier water in Cook County communities and is administered by Elevate, to a nonprofit that wants everyone to have access to clean and affordable heat, cooling, power, and water in their homes and communities. In collaboration with the Cook County Bureau of Economic Development and with funding provided by the American Rescue Plan Act. It's free technical assistance aimed at helping municipalities develop lead service line replacement programs and implement water affordability best practices. And we maintain a website, and you can see the landing page here, with technical assistance resources for lead service line replacement and water affordability issues facing Cook County community water suppliers. We have recently added notification templates. They've been up there for a little while, but we do keep adding to them. So do go there to find those, and they're in English and Spanish. And other new resources from Cook County Water Affordability Program, highlighting the importance of capital improvement planning for lead service line replacement, and more. We're also looking forward to updating our state revolving fund public water supply loan program application scoring map. That's a mouthful, but we are looking to update that in the next week or two. So it will include the new principal forgiveness allocation percentage score for each census tract. And the map will be live on our website soon to help communities target census tracts with the highest need and potential for principal forgiveness as they prepare their SRF applications. So go to the cookcountytap.org website, and while you're there, sign up for our newsletter to get notified when new information and resources become available. And with that, I'll let the LeadCare Illinois team share their screen and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the setup, Ruth, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caroline Pakenham, and I'm here today with Elevate. We're a nonprofit organization, and we are headquartered here in Chicago. And for more than 20 years, Elevate has partnered with schools and child care providers across the state of Illinois to really help them identify and address lead hazards in the early learning environment. And today, as Ruth mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Liz Ornelas, as well as Brian Cox from IDPH. And we will be going into the details of lead and water testing requirements for schools and child care facilities in Illinois today. We can go to the next slide. This is just kind of a roadmap of our conversation today. We will get started by walking you through the testing and mitigation requirements that are specific for childcares and schools to undertake. And then from there, we'll look at the related requirements for community water suppliers in Illinois. And then once we have that regulatory context, what we'll do is we'll introduce the recently relaunched LeadCare Illinois program, which has a lot of great resources to help childcares, schools, and community water suppliers with lead and water testing and mitigation support for this audience. The presentation component of today will probably only take about 40 minutes. And then, as Ruth said, we'll take time at the end to answer any questions that you have. So definitely feel free to put those in the chat today. And if we can skip the next slide and then go to the next one. Yep. So before we get into the details of the testing requirements for these three different groups, we did just want to take a moment to kind of step back and focus on why it's so important to address lead in the early learning environment. And as many of you know, there is no known safe level of lead in a child's blood. And so what this means is it's really important to reduce exposure wherever we can. And this includes from lead in drinking water. Lead, it's a toxic metal and it persists in our environment and it can build up in our bodies over time. And infants, young children, and fetuses are especially vulnerable to lead because their brains and nervous systems are still developing and forming critical connections. So even low levels of lead in blood, it can have serious impacts on children, including learning and behavior challenges, lower IQ, hyperactivity, slow growth, hearing problems, and anemia. We can go to the next slide. And so now that we have kind of that background on why it's so important to address lead in the early learning environment, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian Cox to talk about what is required of childcares and schools in our state on the lead testing and mitigation front. So Brian, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. And just real quick, as introduced, I'm Brian Cox. I'm with the Illinois Department of Public Health, the Plumbing and Water Quality Program Manager. And so one of the reasons that we are involved with this is specifically because we had gotten brought into the regulation of plumbing, which obviously is where the majority of the lead and water issues arise from. And so specifically when there was an act that was passed, 099-0922, that included some requirements for both schools and childcare providers specific to lead and water. And so the licensed childcares that were built on or before January 1st of 2000 were required to test all cooking and drinking water sources for lead. And each one of those results were required to be submitted to DCFS and made available to parents and caregivers. If lead was found to be at or above 2.01 parts per billion, sorry about that, they must implement immediate actions and develop a long-term mitigation plan to reduce those lead levels, share that mitigation plan with DCFS and parents and caregivers, and then retest until 2 consecutive tests show lead levels below 2.01 parts per billion. One of the questions that we get a lot of times is, where does that 2.01 parts per billion come from? And the reality is that back when this got established, we had looked at what most of the laboratories at that time could do, and 2.0 parts per billion was what was considered to be accepted. So going back to what Caroline said on the last slide with regards to there is no acceptable level of lead that's known to be safe for human consumption. It was really based on that because it's the most susceptible population is that age that's under 6. And so trying to coincide with that, they established that regulatory limit at 2.01 parts per billion for mitigation at those child care facilities. Could you please advance to the next slide, Liz? Thank you. So that was for the child care, and so now talking about the requirements for the schools. Schools built on or before January 1st, 2000 and serving 10 or more students in pre-K, in grades pre-K through grade 5 were obligated to test all potable water outlets by the end of 2018. And they did have a tiered approach where, depending upon the year of construction, some were required to be submitted by the end of 2017, but all of them were required to be submitted by the end of 2018. If you found lead in water at those school facilities that was at or above 5 parts per billion, then a notification was required to be sent directly to parents or legal guardians. But all results were required to be submitted to IDPH, and all results were required to at least have an indirect notification to those parents and legal guardians. So You'll note that there's a little bit of a difference in what that regulatory limit is. And so the 5 parts per billion is effectively what was just established within that law. And part of the reason for that too is based upon the mitigation levels that are acceptable for filtration. In addition to the regulatory lead level under the Lead Poisoning Prevention Code, that coincides a little bit more with that 5 parts per billion. With that being said, that first bullet point with regards to all schools being required, or all schools constructed on or before that January 1st, 2000, the results were required to be submitted to IDPH by the end of 2018. There are some schools that may not have submitted those, and so we did send out direct communications to those schools. I believe it was 2 years ago, notifying them that we do still expect those schools to submit that. So the majority of the results that we have available to us were conducted prior to 2018, but if there are schools that did not submit it by then, we're still willing to accept those results just to ensure that they have shown that they've tried to comply with that requirement. Next slide, please. So for the testing procedure, they were required to do a 2-step sampling procedure at each cooking and drinking water source, where there was a first draw sample and a 30-second flush sample collected. So that first draw sample is really to try to identify whether or not there's contamination associated with that fixture level. So if you've got a faucet, if it's directly associated with that faucet, and then the 30-second flush is to get a better understanding of what's a little bit further back within that plumbing system. So the pipes that are effectively leading up to that fixture. And so there's no, so basically you just take that first draw sample, immediately turn on the cold water for 30 seconds, and then collect that second sample as well. We require the use of 250 milliliter bottles for collection, with the exception of ice, which required that 1 liter bottle, just because obviously when ice melts down, it shrinks in volume. And those samples were required to be collected after an 8 to 18 hour stagnation period. And so basically no water should be used within those facilities for a minimum of 8 hours and a maximum of 18 hours before those samples were collected. And so the idea there is trying to mimic what a normal stagnation period is going to be at many of these facilities without necessarily skewing those results. Next slide, please. So the Illinois requirements for the Lead Service Line Replacement and Notification Act, it required high-risk facilities like child cares to be prioritized in plans. Again, with the understanding that there's acknowledgement that those younger populations are more susceptible to lead poisoning, which puts the focus on those types of facilities for prioritization if there was lead service line replacement. It also established those licensing standards for child care providers, where it directed DCFS to directly establish the requirements, which they did, which was acknowledged on that previous slide. Next slide, please. For the LeadCare Illinois specifically, these results are based upon the facilities that have been currently tested through the LeadCare Illinois program. There's been approximately 14,000 lead and water samples that have been collected that are represented by these results here. 42% of those providers have at least one sample at or above 2.01 parts per billion. And of those providers, 3% had a sample that was above 50 parts per billion, 20% was found between 10 and 50 parts per billion, and then 25% had lead in more than 50% of the samples. So quite a few of these providers are obviously finding that lead in water, some at very high levels of lead. Next slide, please. And then this is essentially a summary of the lead sampling results that we had received for schools within Illinois. And I'll point out that those categories that we have, or the numbers that we have, that's really representing whatever their highest concentration was for each one of the samples that they'd collected. And so there was only 12.5% of the facilities that did not have a single lead detection within those samples. 21.74% found their highest sample had lead detected at less than 5 parts per billion. 25% was in that 5 to 15%, or sorry, the 5 to 15 parts per billion range. And then roughly 40.48% was actually their highest sample was actually found above 15 parts per billion. So pretty substantial number of these school facilities that were tested were reporting at least one fixture that had lead and water, and approaching half of the sample, or half the facilities that were sampled actually had at least one sample that was at or above 15 parts per billion, which, as many of you are aware, was the action level for the lead and copper rule for quite some time. And so on the heat map there, you can see just a distribution of the positivity. It's not found in just one location. It's all throughout the state. Obviously, there's just more schools up in those metropolitan areas. But you'll find each one of those colors scattered throughout the state. So we are seeing positives, not necessarily just in certain areas of the state, but realistically all over. That being said, Cook County, as you can see, up in that northeastern region, there's a lot of green dots up there, which is the no positivity. But then if you were able to break that out, you would actually be able to see that there's a lot of the other colors up there as well, representing the fact that there are quite a few schools up even in Cook County that have lead and water. Next slide. And with that being said, I will turn it back over to Caroline to talk with regards to testing requirements for community water suppliers.
Great. Thank you so much for all of that, Brian. So up until this point, we've really focused on what schools and childcares need to do to comply with lead and water testing requirements. And so we are going to shift now to the role of community water suppliers. So in this section, what we'll cover is we'll talk about the types of facilities that community water suppliers are required to test, how often sampling needs to take place, notification requirements that need to be sent to schools and childcares, the required sampling protocol. It is a little bit different from what Brian just introduced, where samples need to be collected, and then the steps that need to happen once test results come back. And the information that we're sharing today in this section, it was provided to us by Illinois EPA. And then we are really lucky that we have Adam Nutt here today to help answer any questions at the end of today's presentation that you might have in this section. We can go to the next slide. All right, so we will get started by looking at the types of facilities that community water suppliers are responsible for testing for lead. So beginning in 2025, community water suppliers are responsible for sampling at elementary schools. So schools that serve any grade from pre-K through 8th grade, as well as licensed childcare facilities in Illinois. There is one important exception to note. So facilities that were built after 2014 are not required to be sampled. Also noting that high schools are handled a little bit differently. So if a school serves grades 9 through 12, then you need to notify them that they can request sampling from the community water supplier. But the supplier is only required to sample if that school actually makes that request. So in other words, for high schools, sampling is request driven. So that's just a little overview of the type of facilities that need to be tested. So now that we've covered the types of facilities, we'll go ahead and shift to talk about when the sampling must occur and then the timeline for that sampling. So the key requirement is that each year, community water suppliers need to sample 20% of elementary schools and 20% of childcare facilities that they serve. So rather than sampling every facility all at once, the work is being spread across a 5-year cycle with 1/5 of eligible facilities sampled each year. And then once that 5-year cycle is complete, then routine lead sampling is no longer required for those facilities. And after that point, Suppliers are only required to conduct sampling when it is requested by a school or childcare facility. A common question is actually what happens when a facility does not participate. So if a facility decides to decline sampling or they don't respond after at least 2 documented outreach attempts to schedule sampling, then that facility may still be counted toward the required 20% for that year. So in other words, community water suppliers are receiving credit for making a good faith effort to complete the sampling and not being penalized when a facility chooses not to participate or can't be reached through the outreach attempts. All right, next slide. This is covering the lead sampling notification requirements for childcares and schools. So we'll start with the annual requirements. So each year, you need to provide information about the health risks from lead to help facilities understand why sampling matters, along with information that lays out the proposed sampling schedule and explains how that lead sampling process actually works. And then 30 days prior to a sampling event, you do need to provide instructions to the facility to help them identify the outlets that are needed to be sampled, and then how to prepare for the sampling event itself. And so that 30-day window is a really important number to remember. It's really giving the facility enough lead time to find the right fixtures and get everything ready for the day of sampling to really ensure that those samples are valid. All right, on the next slide, we will get into the sampling protocol for how the samples actually need to be collected. So you are going to need to collect samples from a cold water tap, and then you are collecting first draw samples. So not the 30-second flush, but making sure to collect the first draw sample. So this is the very first water out of the tap is what's being collected. And the sample volume is 250 milliliters. And then the stagnation window is the same as what Brian mentioned earlier. It's an 8 to 18 hour stagnation window. And so that will be really important direction to give the childcare facilities and schools in that 30-day letter that you send out to help them prepare for the sampling event. All right, the next slide. So now we'll cover where samples need to be collected within schools and childcare facilities. These requirements, they are a little bit different for schools and childcare, so we'll walk through each setting one at a time. For schools, you're going to need to collect 5 samples, 2 of these from drinking water fountains, 1 from a kitchen faucet, 1 from a classroom, and then 1 from a nurse's office. And then these locations, they're really intended to capture areas where children are most likely to drink water or where it's being used for food preparation. And then for childcare facilities, the sampling requirement is a little smaller, but it's still focused on those key areas of use. And so 2 samples are required, 1 from a drinking water fountain and 1 from a kitchen faucet. And then for both schools and childcare facilities, if one of the required locations does not exist in the building, then an alternate location used for drinking or food preparation can be substituted. I will say, there are a lot of home-based childcares in the state of Illinois that are licensed, and many of them do not have drinking water fountains. So you might encounter that at those licensed facilities. All right, we can go to the next slide. So once the sampling is complete at the facility, there are a few important follow-up steps that you're going to need to keep in mind and put into place. And the first is reporting. So you're going to need to provide Illinois EPA with a copy of the sample results from a certified laboratory. And then if lead is detected in any of the samples, you should also provide the facility with US EPA's 3 T's guidance for reducing lead in drinking water. And so this is a really helpful resource that is walking facilities through training, testing, and then taking action if lead is found. And then while community water suppliers are not required to carry out mitigation activities, they are encouraged to support facilities when requested. And later today, actually, coming up next, Liz will share more information with you about the mitigation assistance that is available through LeadCare Illinois for all licensed childcare facilities and schools in the state of Illinois. So that should help you out on that front. And we'll go to the final slide in this section. And we do just want to note that community water suppliers, they can request a waiver for lead sampling requirements in certain situations. So lead sampling, it can be waived if testing has previously been completed at a facility in a method that is matching the sampling requirement that we discussed today or was completed by another state agency. And any waiver request, it does need to be sent to the Illinois EPA, and you can do that at the email address you see here on the slide, epa.leadandcopper@illinois.gov, and then you'll need to include a copy of the facility's sample results. And waivers will only waive the initial sampling event. There's no waiver for a school that requests the lead sampling from a community water supplier. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Liz to introduce you all to the recently relaunched LeadCare Illinois program, which has some really helpful resources for testing and mitigation.
Hi, thank you, Caroline. So with the LeadCare Illinois, we're going to go over what the program offers and how to enroll. So LeadCare Illinois offers lead and water testing and mitigation support for licensed child care facilities, along with schools that are registered with the Illinois School Board of Education. The program's administered by Elevate and funded through the Illinois Department of Public Health with coordination of an IEPA-approved lab for sampling process, and Illinois Action for Children is our partner organization to help connect with the childcare community. The program offers lead testing to childcares and schools, and we mail them sample bottles with instructions on how to complete the sampling process themselves. We also offer step-by-step support on how to take action mitigating lead. A new feature with the program is a mitigation reimbursement to eligible participants. So we'll go over how that process works. And the program also offers lead safety trainings and educational fact sheets on reducing lead in their water. So as far as lead testing, it's a pretty simple process on how to enroll. The child cares and schools enroll online, and then they receive the test kit with all their instructions, welcome letters, and a prepaid shipping label to return the bottles to the lab directly. We'll provide them their results through email, and then any results that have lead detected above 2.01 parts per billion do receive a courtesy call and guidance on how to reduce those lead levels with short-term and long-term strategies on reducing lead. And then those that do have lead can apply for mitigation reimbursement assistance. We also offer no cost for any retesting that has to happen afterwards. And we have our call center that's available to provide support in both English and Spanish. So for childcares and schools with lead above 2.01 parts per billion or greater, they can apply to receive mitigation support. We do give priority to facilities with lead in their water above 15 parts per billion or higher. Communities located in a lead action level exceedance community within the past 5 years, and then those that serve children under the age of 6 will be prioritized. However, we encourage all schools and childcares that have lead detected above that 2.01 parts per billion to apply. And as far as the process for applying for mitigation reimbursement, they can submit an application online. We just require a copy of test results showing that they have lead above that action level. And then we just reach out to them by phone to discuss mitigation options that are available to them to those problem fixtures. They will then work with a registered plumber of their choosing to get a cost estimate for those mitigation options that we referred them to. Once they get a quote, they send it over to us and we review it and approve it. We'll send them an agreement form for signature. Once that's all signed, they'll work with that plumber to get the work done. Once the work is completed, we'll process the required documents for reimbursement, and then we'll move the facility right into retesting to see what those results will look like from that point forward. And here's a list of like the eligible activities that we offer: faucet, fixture, and drinking fountain replacements, plumbing fitting replacements, point of use filter installations, water pitcher filters and replacement filters, lead or galvanized service line replacement or removal of interior lead pipes, valves, or lead soldered joints, plumbing reconfiguration, and installation of automatic flushing systems. So each mitigation project must be under 50,000, and there's no limit to the number of fixtures or strategies that they use as long as there's lead detected in those fixtures. And our cost per fixture does include both material and labor cost. So here you can see on the right listed as max, the 725 for the kitchen faucet. That's including both labor and material there. So, how can you help spread the word about LeadCare Illinois through your communication channels and networks? Directly refer child cares and schools to the program, and then just understanding the resources offered through LeadCare Illinois and the mandatory requirements for schools and child cares. All right, and that kind of wraps up our presentation here for you all.
Okay, I do have one question. It's kind of a big one. Are you ready? Yes. Explain how LeadCare Illinois can help with lead service line replacement.
I can start. Oh, go ahead, Liz. You go for it.
Yeah, I can go ahead and start and then you can add anything to it. But LeadCare Illinois does offer $10,000 in reimbursement to child cares or schools that get their lead service line replacement done. So that is just part of the cost, but it is something that we're able to offer through our program here.
Would anybody else like to add something to that? Okay. Here's another question. And I think you did say something about this, one of you, either Caroline or Liz, about whether community water systems can actually reference LeadCare Illinois as a resource for getting their water testing and mitigation in their materials that they send out to schools and childcare facilities.
Yeah, we definitely encourage folks on this call, including in your communications with child cares and schools, to reference the LeadCare Illinois program. Especially if they happen to find lead in their water, there's kind of this whole host of resources that we provide for mitigation support, from the reimbursement that Liz went into, also with just like mitigation planning. We can walk through each kind of step of the process. If they want to, if they need to collect all samples at their facility, we can help with that. We can also help with the retesting. So we definitely encourage folks to spread the word about LeadCare Illinois. And we also have a flyer about the program and a social media share kit that we can maybe send out in a follow-up email to folks on this call.
Fantastic. Okay, I have a little bit more technical question here. So the LeadCare lead and copper rule revisions and improvements have been published, and in it talks about, it does add schools and child cares into testing for lead and water. And it has certain deadlines, et cetera. So my question to, I think, both Brian and Adam, or this question to Brian and Adam, I think would be the place to direct it, is if schools and child cares have tested before by the 2018 deadline that Brian referenced, do they need to test again under the new LCRR and LCRI?
So I can take this one. This is Adam. They will need to test again under the LCRI and LCRR. The cutoff for the LCRI sample results that we can use is 2020. And so if they've tested 2020 or later, then they can submit us those full lab results and we can use those to go through the waiver process that was mentioned, but we can't accept results prior to 2020.
Great, that's really important information. Thank you for that, Adam. The other question, another technical question. So for residential testing, there's the fifth leader element. I won't, we all sort of know here what that means. So residential testing is different than schools and childcares. So the testing method that you guys indicated here is for schools and childcares only and not for residential. Is that true?
That's correct. The LCRR and LCRI is the first draw sampling, and the intent of that is to get the lead results from the water that's currently in the premise plumbing. Whereas the residential testing, that first and fifth leader, that fifth leader for residential testing is to try to get the concentration of lead that's in the water that's sitting in the service line running to the residents. But the procedure for schools and childcare is just the first draw meant to test the water that's going to first come out of that tap that would be consumed.
Gotcha. Thank you. Another question about, again, the rules is the 20% per year. So under LCRRI, they say that you have to test your schools and childcares at 20% each per year. So what I think the question here, as I'm interpreting it, is do they need to, if they don't test 20%, can they do 25 the next year? Can they do 30 in the third year? Does it escalate up, or how does that work?
So it's a minimum of 20% per year until you've sampled all of your schools. And so it is absolutely allowable to go over that 20%. We've had quite a few water supplies that just opted to test all of their schools and childcare facilities up front. But it can the minimum has to be 20%, and then they can go over, and then if they're down to like only 10% or 5% left for their last year of testing, that would complete it. That would be fine. And so they can always go over. It's just there's a minimum 20% until they're done with all of the schools and childcare facilities.
Gotcha. So minimum per year of 20%, but you could do 25, 20, 30 in a year, but you can't do 15% in a year. You have to do at least 20.
That's correct.
Great. This is a question for the LeadCare Illinois folks. Do you have resources in Spanish or other languages for the communities that you serve? Are there people in-house that can answer questions in other languages?
So our primary languages are just English and Spanish, and all of our resources are translated in Spanish. We are, I guess, open to developing more materials if needed in other languages. We just haven't really come across that as a need so far.
Thank you. So we do have more of a statement rather than a question. And Mr. Williams, if you wanted to come off or add to this, please. The statement is the sample demand we received had us test the same schools 2 times in a row with no new sites.
Okay. I can sort of address this one. So we sent out the sample demand letters this year for the 2026 sampling year. If we didn't have the results in our system, we included all of the sample sites for last year as well. So if you have a sample demand that has repeat sites that you would have already tested, that means you should probably just go ahead and email me or the epa.leadandcopper@illinois.gov inbox with a copy of your results again. Just resubmit those, because that letter means that on our system, we're showing that we have not received those results yet.
Okay, great. Doing some business here today. I like that. So that is almost wrapping up all the questions. I have one question. I think this is for Brian Cox. So we have this data on school and child care facilities that have had elevated leads. And the question here is, has anybody looked into correlation between those facilities with high leads and perhaps lead poisoned children that have been reported? I'm just curious, the questioner is curious about that.
Yeah, so I know that our lead poisoning prevention program, that they're aware of the different facilities that have had that high lead, and I know that they're also aware of the various zip codes that are considered high risk zip codes due to the fact that they do have an elevated number of children within those communities above the actionable limit. That being said, I don't believe that they were able to identify a specific correlation between those schools and the blood levels within those children. But it's not necessarily something that they were able to make direct comparisons to where they had that information for every single person that's had that test to where they could actually compare to, like if you're thinking about when you're doing testing, you have to have a control. I don't believe that they have that information for those controls to be able to actually make it a direct comparison like that, if that
Okay,
makes
great.
sense.
So I want to encourage folks to add more questions to the Q&A if you want. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can add them to the chat, and Adam Nutt just added something there also about the testing. So I think that's directed to Mr. Williams. So there you go. And there are no more questions in the chat at this time. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my screen up real quick. And while I do that, if anybody has additional questions that they'd like to share, please add them. So again, thanks to everyone for being here today, including all of our presenters and question answerers. Thank you, Adam Nutt, for being here to answer questions. This is a great opportunity, again, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat, because we have such a huge wealth of knowledge here today. But as a wrap up, I will just go ahead and say that this is the end of the webinar. Thank you to the entire team here. As I said before, we appreciate everyone taking time out of your busy day. This is our contact information for Cook County TAP. The presentation will be posted on our Cook County TAP channel on YouTube. So that's at Cook County TAP. Really have it right there, at Cook County TAP. And that should be posted in the next week or so. And there are a number of other webinars there as well. And there is one credit hour that can be applied for this presentation. And I will send out that ID with the post presentation follow-up. And I think that's it. I'm going to check here one more time if there's any other questions in the Q&A. And we don't have any. So there you go.
Ruth,
Thanks so much, everyone. Yes, go ahead.
It looks like there is one more in the chat where they ask about funding for private residences to mitigate.
Okay, great.
And the only thing I wanted to add to that is that we do have a program called Clear Win. So not to be confused with the WIN grant that's administered by US EPA. But the Clear Win program is a state-run program that's run by IDPH. And there is some opportunities there. So it's not necessarily across the board because they've issued that as a grant to other partner agencies. And I'm not sure if anybody from the Elevate team wants to comment on that too, but there are opportunities for the replacement of some lead pipes or plumbing materials that contain lead through that program.
Okay, I believe that is it. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to all our speakers and attendees. We will follow up with you with an email about the continuing education credits. But until the next time, have a great week and see you soon.